Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to start with a completely giddy and exhilarated remark, which is to thank Al and Caroline Olson for making the Stegner Award happen and giving me, I don't know how we measure joy in life, but the joy of having people who I admire so much and am so beyond, giddy and exhilarated, that's not right, exhilarated, that's too weak. So this would be one of a series where I am so grateful to you for giving me the chance to bring these and to introduce these people who are luckier than they can imagine at this moment. Tonight, this has not been the case with every Stegner Award. Oh, there, okay, now I'm back. Every Stegner Award, we have not really, not to say a thing against some of the more, I don't know if we call them solemn people, but we have not always been able to pair the Stegner Award with the Humor Initiative. The solemn people are very nice. Yeah. We have so loved having them, but this is not the first time where we have paired these, because we had Senator Alan Simpson and his family, his brother Pete and his wife Ann, his sister-in-law Lynn, and they are very funny, so this happened before. But this is a particular pleasure because I do feel that our guest tonight, should he choose this, and he has not chosen this entirely, he could give Mark Twain a run for his money.
Go Dave.
Do you want to say something about that?
Patty is a lovely lady, and she is very, very generous. Sometimes people laugh at my stories, but Mark Twain is
yes. Do you want to say just a word about what your wife says about your sense of humor?
That I'm not funny.
More stark than I had planned. So I am so grateful, and that causes me to also be able to thank Jane and Bill Reynolds, who support the Humor Initiative. So, in a somewhat presumptuous next move, I did know Wallace Stegner quite well, and I am going to speak on his behalf. I think that I know that Wallace Stegner would have approved of everyone to whom we have given this award. I think I know that. He didn't totally assent to this. When we created the award, Charles Wilkinson wrote him, and he said he was very pleased with that. And then just as he didn't get to stay with us on the planet long enough to really see what we were doing with it, I think he would love it. It's presumptuous that I'm going to assert that I know that he would have been happy with all of our choices, but I'm going one step further in presumption by saying that he would have been particularly pleased with our choice tonight. Why am I making that presumption? Because of the remark that Wallace Stegner often made about what he called the stickers, the people who settle in and stay, in contrast to the people who move through the West, who flit here and there, who settle for a little bit and then find something else that draws them on. So Wallace Stegner was always remarking on the people who stick and who thereby are the creators, Indian people, of course, preeminent in that, and those who have followed Indian people sometimes really participating in that, becoming local and making a difference in Western life and culture. So here is a quotation from Wallace Stegner's essay in the Lemonade Springs book. For somehow, against probability, some sort of recognizable culture has been growing on Western ranches and in Western towns and even in Western cities. It is the product not of the boomers, but of the stickers, not of those who pillage and run, but of those who settle and who love the life they have made and the places they have made it in. The Wallace Stegner Award from the Southern American West goes to a person who has, in the most consistent and principled and moving way, represented the best values of the American West. This year we have element of timing. I'll step very lightly on this area, but we have the added benefit of paying attention to a person whose conduct and an example in a very trying, very soul-testing, character-straining historical episode. His example could make an enormous difference to our troubled and polarized nation. So our timing, I believe, is providential. So now, at the urging of our executive director, whose orders I follow scrupulously, it was, where are you? Are you laughing?
He's managing something.
Oh, he's out there laughing. Okay, so I was assigned to give you a quick overview of the incidents in Harney County that we will be talking about, so that you'll have a frame of reference as we go into the stories of our, in no way equivalent to Mark Twain figure. Although Mark Twain started with the oral tradition, I'm just going to say that Mark Twain told stories and then he began writing them down. So that is a transition Mark Twain went through. So just to say that happened here. So here is, this will seem like a little bit of a history lesson, because I guess it is. So here are some statements about Harney County, which I have visited a couple of times now. Harney County had a tumultuous and conflict-filled history in the 19th century. Nostalgia for a tranquil, calmer era, not so well supported by evidence. And by contrast, Harney County in the last couple of decades has made remarkable achievements in collaborative decision-making with the work of a consortium called the High Desert Partnership of Ranchers, Environmentalists, and Federal Land Managers, for reasons that I suppose we could guess at, even though Harney County received very intense press coverage in 2016. Certain, I guess they're quite respected, I suppose they should be, publications like the New York Times never wrote about the fact that there had been this tradition of collaboration in Harney County. So, well, let's not pick on the media, shall we? Let's not do that. Let's move on here. The Malheur National Wildlife Refuge is an extraordinary place for migratory wildfowl. And when that is in season, it is absolutely stunning to see the creatures swirling up and just great spirals of white. And anyway, it is also a reconstructed and restored landscape with an enormous investment of ingenuity, labor, engineering skill from the Fish and Wildlife Service. It was quite devastated by unregulated grazing that was put back together into the landscape it is now. Now, in 2012, two Harney County ranchers, the father and son, Dwight and Stephen Hammond, were charged with setting fires on public lands, a federal offense. They were sentenced to prison, though with some tangled elements of the setting of the exact terms of the sentence. In 2014, a considerable distance away from Harney County, the Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy, who had been refusing to pay the fees for grazing his cattle on Bureau of Land Management lands, orchestrated an armed standoff with a variety of anti-government activists rallying to support Cliven Bundy's stance in Bunkerville, Nevada. In the fall of 2015, Cliven Bundy's sons, Ammon and Ryan, became a presence in Harney County, Oregon, insisting that Dwight and Stephen Hammond should not go to prison, even though the Hammonds declared that they did not want the Bundys' support. In November of 2015, Harney County Sheriff David Ward began a process of discussion and negotiation with the Bundys and their various allies. On November 19th, Ammon Bundy brought a number of his armed associates to a tense meeting in the sheriff's office. You'll hear more about that. Excuse me. On January 2nd, 2016, after a public rally, the Bundys led an armed occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, insisting that the federal lands in Harney County and in the West should be returned to the ranchers, who the Bundys declared were the original owners of those lands. Our distinguished visitor, Charlotte Rodriguez, a year or so ago, was the person that was the tribal chairwoman of the Burns Paiute, and she was good-natured but forceful in pointing out that that term, original owners, could use a little more thought. On January 7th, 2016, following a town hall that convened in Burns on January 6th, at which many local citizens expressed the wish that wondered if someone had just gone and asked the Bundys and their followers to leave the refuge. In responding to that town hall on January 6th, on January 7th, Sheriff Ward initiated a meeting with Ammon Bundy and proposed that the occupiers leave the refuge with a safe escort. Bundy refused the offer. Sheriff Ward continued to pursue a peaceful resolution to the standoff, doing everything he could to prevent violence, injury, or death. Sheriffs from other Oregon counties, agents from the FBI, and a variety of figures settled into Burns, Oregon. On January 26th, one of the occupiers, Lavoy Finicum, was killed at a roadblock set up by various law enforcement officials. For Sheriff Ward, this death was the lowest point. By February 11th, the last occupier left the refuge and a season of charges and trials began.
It's like Patty got it all wrapped up. It's
I
gonna
got
be early.
We're going to do this in two segments. The first segment, we are going to discuss the history that I just reviewed, but with this right in the midst of things. And I will say, he did not operate alone. He had allies and teammates aplenty, and we'll hear about that. But repeatedly, when it came to one person negotiating, standing forward, it was this person. Also in some of the private meetings with these interesting figures. So many people worked to hold this community together in a very tough time, and reliably present in that cause of holding things together was this person. So, how did the Bundys first come into your world?
So, the first time I met Ammon Bundy was November 5th of 2015. A lot of folks believe that the refuge...
Okay, can we get the sound turned up a little bit, do you think?
How's this?
Oh, don't turn the sound up anymore. No, turn the sound down. No.
Folks think that this began on January 2nd when they took over the refuge, but the fact is I had been dealing with these folks for close to 2 months at that point. And the first time I met these gentlemen, Ammon Bundy and a militia leader who was involved in the Bunkerville standoff, came to my office and expressed to me that they wanted me to intervene on the behalf of the Hammonds and tell the federal government that they had no authority in Harney County and that the Hammonds would not be turning themselves into prison. And with that, we had a bit of a civics lesson there in my office about how our government was set up and meant to operate, and because these guys explained that the Hammonds never should have been going back to prison. It was double jeopardy, and I heard them out. And what had happened with the Hammond case is, yes, they did set some fires and they were convicted, but the crimes they were convicted of carried a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence in prison. And what happened at the sentencing was the initial judge determined that 5 years was too harsh and didn't want to sentence them to that. So he sentenced one of them to 3 months in prison and one of them to 12 months in prison. And these gentlemen went off to prison, they did their time, they came home, they were not an issue in the community, they were productive citizens. I personally have met and liked both of these gentlemen, but the fact is that the mandatory minimum set by law had not been met. So the prosecution appealed the sentence to the Ninth Circuit Court. The Ninth Circuit Court found that these gentlemen had to go back to prison and finish the 5-year mandatory minimums. And that's where the initial spark of this protest came in, was based off of them returning to prison. Now, neither one of those gentlemen asked me to do any of the things that the Bundy family had demanded that I do, which was stand up, claim sovereignty as the county sheriff, tell the federal government they had no jurisdiction there, and basically tell the federal court system to go pound sand. That's not exactly the way that our system of government works. And so when I explained this to these guys, I said, you have a congressman, You go home and you call your congressman, you explain to your congressman that you're unhappy with mandatory minimum sentences and you would like him to relook that at the next legislative session. And I explained a little bit about how we as citizens have a responsibility to vote. If your congressman's not doing his job, you and your neighbors replace him with a better congressman. And they explained to me that what I was describing was a democracy, and we are not a democracy, we are a republic.
Well, civics lessons, they go in all directions. Could you just quickly say something about the phrase a peaceful protest or a peaceful takeover and what that meant on January 2nd?
Well, under our system of government, we have the right to protest. And there's a big difference between a peaceful protest and what occurred in our community. There was a protest that took place in our community, and there was roughly 400 people that showed up and marched on behalf of the Hammonds. And a lot of those folks did not do anything wrong. They were decent folks, showed up, they exercised their rights. But there was another portion of that group that used that protest as a smokescreen, and they peeled off and drove down to the Malheur Wildlife Refuge and took it over. And by taking it over, I mean they actually employed military room clearing type tactics and went through armed and ensured that there was nobody there to prevent them from keeping that refuge headquarters, which I don't count as a peaceful protest.
So now can we hear about your effort on January 7th to reach a peaceful resolution?
Yes, the reason that I chose to go out and meet in person with Ammon Bundy on that date was on January 6th we had a town hall meeting. And this was a first for me. This whole thing was a classroom. I learned things I hoped I'd never learn in life. And
you might mention, because it's such a great line, when you talked to the other sheriff and you said to the other sheriff, I've never had an experience like this. And the sheriff said. So
yeah, I was pretty much a baby sheriff back then. This armed takeover happened on my first day, or my 1 year anniversary in office was when this armed takeover occurred. And I had contacted the executive director of the Sheriff's Association and said, look, I need some help out here. I've never dealt with anything like this. And John just says back to me, he says, none of us have, buddy. So, but thank God I was in Oregon where we have a strong Sheriff's Association. You know, and in Burns, we really work through a collaborative process in working with environmental groups and ranching and you know, the industry and government agencies. Well, the sheriffs do the same thing. When we have a strong Sheriff's Association, and some of those guys are really heroes to me, and they showed up and they helped me through this time. And it was a learning experience for all of us. But it's one of those instances where you really have to leave your ego outside the door and go in and sit down with a group of people and try to map out the best response you can to this incident.
So you said quotably that if someone says to you, well, you have been in the middle on all this, you have an interesting way of saying how it is that you end up in the middle, which possibly you don't know what I'm referring to because you're so quotable, but you may forget how quotable you are. So, what has to happen for you to be in the middle? You vote. Okay, you have this beautiful phrase about, yes, you say, I'm in the middle once I have cooled down. Once I have gone through a process of cooling down.
I'm hoping I'm not alone in this, but my first reaction isn't always my best one. So a lot of times, especially when there's a critical incident going on, a lot of times you have to process that information and work through it in my head before I can come back and say something. And so when I talk about, finding forgiveness in my heart for somebody and moving forward, typically that wasn't my first emotion. So for me to find the middle ground in something, I've typically gone through a series of, I guess check marks in my brain before I get to that point.
Okay, so now we can go back to January 7th in your visit whenever you want. Or I cut you off and you should finish what you were saying.
No, that's okay. She told me she was going to do that earlier because I talk a lot. And,
I would know nothing about that habit myself. I am very foreign.
So we had a town hall meeting on January 6th, and I had been in negotiations with these guys for close, actually 2 months at that point. Initially it was, please don't come to my community and do anything, and here are the facts behind this. There's a lot of misinformation out there on the internet, and you can't believe that. And I went and I researched the Hammond case, and I would dispute the things they had to say with facts. And they had a lot of things to say about the sentencing of the Hammonds. Well, I got a copy of the sentencing transcripts from the court and said, there you go, there's a lot of misinformation and things that you're putting out about the sentencing. And so we live in a day and age where everything's on video, everything's on YouTube, it's on the news, and people have gotten to the point, even in the courtrooms, well, do you have a video of the incident? And people want to see it firsthand. And so at that meeting that night, I realized when people were coming to the microphone, and several people asked, well, has anybody just gone out and asked them to leave? But,
no.
Sorry, my language is a bit harsh at times. I thought, hell, I asked them not to come here. And so that night I said, you know what? I'll go, because that's what my community asked me to do. That's the position that I hold. And I'm there to serve the people, I'm there to keep the peace, and I'm there to look out for the best interest of my communities and enforce the law. And so, first, a lot of the FBI folks didn't want me to have a town hall meeting, but I said, this is my community, these are my people, I'm going to go down there, because the reason I had that meeting was one of the Bundy brothers had said to a member of the press, if the community asks us to go home, we'll go home. So I went up to the command post, I walked in, there's a room full of, state police people and FBI people and deputies from around the state, and I said, I want a town hall meeting tomorrow down at the fairgrounds. And they all looked at me like I was nuts, which I'm a little off. And they made it happen. And it was a huge town hall meeting for our area. We had somewhere in the range of 500 people in the room, and our total county population was around 7,200 people. So we actually had more people in the room for that meeting than we have registered voters in the county. And so it was a huge success as a town hall meeting, and the majority of the people in there, and I talked with a negotiator, and they gave me some pointers, and they said, if you can get people to raise their hands, and so I asked how many people wanted to see it in peacefully and see these guys go home, and nearly every hand in the room went up. But when we gave an open mic, but to our citizens, because I didn't want to hear from people that didn't live there, because I put that meeting together specifically to hear from our citizens on what they wanted in our community. And so when citizens started coming to the microphone and said, maybe somebody should go out and talk to them in person and ask them to leave, I thought, gosh, I've been talking to them forever. So I went back to the command post and I said, I want a meeting with Ammon Bundy tomorrow. And of course, I got the same look I got the first time from all these people, because, apparently I'm hard to deal with. So we got it set up, and myself and the sheriff of Malheur County and the sheriff of Tillamook County out there in Oregon went with me. And we picked a location, a neutral site, about 6 miles from the refuge. We went out there, we set up. My lieutenant called one of his militia leaders and said, the sheriff's waiting out at this spot, wants to talk to Ammon Bundy. We have X number of people here, X number of vehicles. We're not going to be offended if you guys bring a security detail of your own. And they did. They came with multiple vehicles. And then somebody tipped off the press that we were out there to meet, so that the whole world would see us ask him to go home. And The press showed up, these folks showed up, we had a discussion out there, offered to let them go home. One, the wheels of justice turn very slowly on the federal side of the house. And that was a federal refuge, those were federal buildings. And so I didn't care if it took 2 years for them to catch up to them and how they resolved it at that point. Nobody had been hurt. All they had done was take over some buildings. There was a lot of rhetoric, but they could have gone home peacefully at that moment. The other sheriffs were happy to get them safe passage out of the state along with me, and they chose not to go.
Did you expect anything else? Did you expect them to?
I didn't expect them to take me up on it and leave, but I hoped that they would be willing to take me up on it. And I remember explaining to Ammon Bundy that, any positives that he was hoping to gain as far as recognition of his cause and things like that, that they were at the peak. It was only going to go downhill from there. And that nobody had been hurt yet, and he stated that they weren't hurting anything, and I explained to him, it only takes one unstable person to do something that causes a disaster. And I know he recognized that.
So talk about what the town of Burns was like with the occupation and with heavily armed people walking the streets, and what was that doing to a community that had much going for it as a group of people living. It's a little remote from other places, and people do seem to be in a community of acquaintanceship and often friendship. So what was happening to that quality in the community, and what was life like at the, I guess I'll go right there and say, at the Safeway store, at the one Safeway store?
So that's a wonderful question, but every person who was there has their own perspective. I can tell you about mine, and there are people who, as time progressed on, supported what these folks were trying to do. There were people who it didn't necessarily affect, and then there were other people who were traumatized by that because that wasn't our community. It's, in the press it was painted like we live in some kind of a Western gun culture where everybody's walking around carrying their rifle wherever they go, which isn't out of the normal. I remember in high school, during deer season, there was rifles in every gun rack. Nobody ever dreamed of bringing one into school. But at the same time, nobody ever packed them through the grocery store either. And so when little old ladies would call the office and say, little old ladies, I have a special spot in my heart because they always make me happy. Some little old ladies would call it in the grocery store. Everything's an AK-47, right? What are they doing with AK-47s in the grocery store? The fact is it changed the face of our community. And what was really sad is it changed the perception of our community elsewhere. A lot of people elsewhere think that these were actually our citizens that were there raising this ruckus. And there's a handful that ended up, joining in. None of them took up arms or anything like that. But so to answer the question is, it really depends on where you were at with this. But what I will say is there were a lot of people that experienced it as a traumatic experience. And for the employees and families of our federal agencies out there, it was a very traumatic experience. For our law enforcement folks and their families, it was very traumatic. But there are some folks that, it just kind of blew through and life's back to normal for them. And for others, it'll never be the same in their own hometown. And that was something that was stolen from our community through the actions of people who weren't from there.
You have wonderful and intense and disheartening remarks to make about what it is for a small community where everybody knows everybody else to have this kind of division just fracturing. And the fact that people had congenial relationships before almost makes it more intense. And we'll talk about that.
Well, it did cause quite a division in our community. And in some cases, there were family members on opposite sides of the fence with differing opinions. There were times where it got almost as hateful as it does in Washington, D.C. And, I'm kind of a dim publican myself. I vote for the person on there based off of who what they've done and what they intend to do for our country. But in this case, there's times where we had family members who, out of the same family who are on one side or the other. And in a small community like that, betrayal feels so much closer. So there's people in our community who were lifelong friends who don't speak to each other anymore. They can walk past without talking. And that's a terrible thing, because I live in a community where if you need to get a gallon of milk from the store, you need to allot 45 minutes to do that while in the store, because you're going to have a conversation with every single person you run into. And that's the type of lifestyle that we had, and that's the reason I lived there and love that community. And that's the reason all of us lived there. That's the lifestyle that we were looking for. And on the surface, the little town looks the same, but under the surface, there are small changes like that where, people have yet to forgive their neighbor and move on. And the sad thing is this is America. We have the right to have differing opinions, and we can still be friends afterwards. You can disagree with me, Patty. We don't have to fight out at the bike rack later.
That's a little bit of a disappointment. I think you said, if I'm quoting this accurately, you said you always thought of yourself as kind of right-wing, and then the Bundys came in and started calling you a liberal.
Yeah, I had no idea I was a liberal. I used to think that I was pretty far to the right. Now I'm somewhere in the middle.
Right. So could you just talk us through, it's too painful a story in many ways, so you can move fast, but get to January 26th and the calamity that day.
So by January 26th, this has drug on in the community for some time. And initially, they had very little support in the community. Due to the fact that things moved slow on the federal side of the house, and I think in Washington, D.C., there was probably some hope that these folks would move on at some point, but that wasn't happening. And they were digging in for the long haul out there. And a lot of people think that everything that occurred just occurred out at the refuge, and that's actually where they kept the smaller number of people. What we had in our community, driving around, flying their "Don't Tread on Me" flags and carrying firearms in our community, was a higher number of militia-type folks. They were staying in local hotels. They were coming out. They were following people around. My parents had bad experiences with them coming, and they figured out who my folks were pretty quick. And Mom and Dad had some confrontations in town. People were harassing my pastor. I was followed to and from work. I got pretty used to it. I'm actually still a little paranoid from it, to be honest with you. A car comes up behind me pretty quick, and I'm looking to see what state they're from. But so it wasn't so much that they had just taken over this refuge and they were out there, and that was a big issue, and it was a big deal. It was the fact that they were working so hard to tear our community apart at the seams back in town, and they had law enforcement outnumbered 3-1 there for a long time. We ended up bringing in law enforcement from outside to help us take back our streets. People would do things, some of these folks would do things to cause the police to conduct a traffic stop on them, and then multiple vehicles would pull up and keep the police at a tactical disadvantage. And so we had to, as they brought their numbers up, we had to bring more police into town. And it changed the face of our community. And for some people it was scary. For some people, it was very annoying. And so there came a point in time where we had to get something done. And these folks, meanwhile, had been left to come and go freely from the refuge. And they had been going around, and they would set up little community meetings and give classes on their version of the Constitution and how they felt that the government was supposed to work, and how the federal governments had no constitutional authority to be there. And they had set one of these up in a neighboring community, so we knew the path that they were going to be traveling. And the FBI and the state police put together a plan to traffic stop them and take the leadership into custody, and that was on January 26th. It was going well, and I was actually very excited about the opportunity to get the leadership into custody, because coming from a military background, I knew that without training and leadership, that these folks would lose interest and go home pretty quickly. They wouldn't be able to hold it together without, they actually had some actually decent leaders out there as far as being able to hold people together and recruit people to the cause. And so without them, I assumed it would die out pretty quickly. They conducted the traffic stop. Ammon Bundy and everybody in his vehicle got out and surrendered to police. There was a gentleman driving another vehicle by the name of LaVoy Finicum. Ryan Payne, who was one of the militia leaders who was deeply involved in Bunkerville in that standoff, and again, had made some of the most alarming comments, alluding to revolution and civil war in my office, excuse me, and had pushed the most for violence, was the only one to jump out of Mr. Finicum's pickup and surrender, which left several people in that vehicle who chose not to surrender. And they confronted the state police, and who are you? We're the Oregon State Police, and they refused to surrender, and they drove away from that traffic stop and came to a roadblock up the road. And at that roadblock, there's several things happened there. One, as they were coming towards it, somebody tried to shoot at the engine block on the vehicle, and the vehicle went off into the snowbank. The driver, Mr. Finicum, jumped out of the vehicle and yelled, "Shoot me," at a SWAT team, which, this is a critical moment in life, and that's a terrible, terrible decision to make. And we're in the midst of a critical incident where for several months now we've been threatened with armed rebellion and armed takeover of our refuge. And there was several moments there of, actually when he jumped out, there were 2 shots that were fired that the investigation determined probably came from one of the federal agents who was there, but nobody admitted to firing those 2 shots. The next few moments, Mr. Finicum did not surrender. Some people claim he had his hands up. They went from here to his jacket, to here to his jacket. And he was shot and killed. And that was actually the lowest point. What should have been, the end, or at least brought the end into sight, really just created the lowest point in that entire incident for me. Everybody had worked together so hard trying to find how we could end this in the most peaceful manner. Avoiding bloodshed at all costs was our biggest goal, and that felt like a crushing failure to me.
Could you talk about your military background as it shaped, influenced, guided you through this whole experience?
So, I joined the Army straight out of high school when I was 18 years old. I actually joined on the delayed entry program not long after I turned 18. And, my dad served in the Army. He joined when he was 17. My big brother joined straight out of high school. He actually joined on the delayed entry program when he was 17 as well. Mom would not sign for me and made me wait until I turned 18. And so I joined it. Our family has always been very patriotic. In fact, I come from a town of about 1,000 people, and just my cousins out of my neighborhood there, and my dad served, my brother served, I served, my Uncle Bob served, my cousins Kenneth, Paul, Steve, they all served, my Uncle John served. You know, that's how we were raised. You serve your country. So I joined when I was 18 years old, and I've always been, I retired from the Army Reserves in 2013 with 21 years of combined service. 8 of those were active duty, and I've always been in the military or in law enforcement with the exception of 2 years in my adult life. And through those experiences, I served in Somalia, and I've served in Afghanistan. I served as a drill sergeant, training soldiers. And as far as this critical incident goes, I had a lot to fall back on as far as training and experience and knowing what it's like to be on a deployment. That's how I knew and firmly believed that without the leadership, they would fall apart. Because if you don't have strong leadership, you can't sit through a deployment. You get homesick. You get nervous. People get to bickering, and so there were a lot of things that I knew. I could tell when I was dealing with somebody who a lot of people want to pretend like they're tactical, but not everybody really does have that background. And you can pick those guys out when you're dealing with them. And so I think that my military lifestyle over the years contributed to being able to work in a stressful environment and still try to find solutions to the problems.
Do you want to say a word or two about your thoughts about what happens to a country when things are not holding together?
I have served in several different countries where there has been a total collapse of infrastructure. In Somalia, you could tell when you were there because at one time the streets were paved, and you'd go past buildings and you'd see where there had been a tourist industry at one time when there was a government in that, and it truly was beautiful in places, just truly beautiful. But there was no governmental structure. It evolved into tribal warfare, genocide. One side started out the others, and it began as a humanitarian mission when we went in there, and it was declared a combat zone while I was there in Somalia. But at one time, there was a governing body there, and it was not in complete chaos. Afghanistan, no true governing body there. Yeah, we were trying to help them to establish a government and drive the, extreme organizations like the Taliban out, and now we have ISIS, which is worse. And, but when you have no governmental no government and no infrastructure, it collapses into kind of the law of the jungle. And when we have people here in this country who think that the right answer to resolving conflict is to try to overthrow the government or spark a civil war or revolution, the same things that they're jumping up and down and screaming about, claiming that our government's going to bring the UN to control the people, and all these overreaching things that people claim the government is doing here, could become a true reality if our government or if our nation was to fall into a civil war. And these folks were out there trying to use our community to spark a revolution. And if we crippled our nation in that manner, it would open us wide up for our enemies abroad to come in here. And the first thing that you see in a civil war elsewhere is the UN showing up. So literally their own actions could have helped lead to what they claim is their bigger fears. And
So on February 11th, I think that was when the last person, very troubled person, left the refuge. And you gave a talk on February 11th where you are extraordinary in saying, good can come of this. We can come back together. There is nothing that we can't work with if we will get off social media, you say, and go to coffee and talk to each other. So it is for somebody who has been through what you have been through, engaged in wartime and other places, and that the 5.5 weeks before that, that is an amazingly affirmative, redemptive speech to have given. Very brief, really to the point. I'm thinking that it might be to say or to show how much you meant that and have tried to deliver on that. Could you tell us about the visit you had on December 28th of 2018?
So, one, I do believe that we need to get off social media. People don't even know how to talk to each other anymore. You know, I have to text my wife across the living room to tell her she looks pretty. So, you know, if we can't find a way to sit down with people that we disagree with, if we can't find a way to communicate with each other without anger and hostility, we can't fix the problems that we face in this country. And so, and I'm going to tell you, I pray about these things because if you just leave it to me, I will create a catastrophe out of things. I'll open my mouth, the wrong thing will fall out. I completely believe in trying to find peace and moving forward. And so on December 28th of this past year, when Ammon Bundy showed up at my office and rang the buzzer, I came out and I looked out through the window. Nobody was standing there, and he was actually standing off behind the door. So I got my head as close to the glass as I could to peer around there, and I saw this guy standing there, and I thought, what in the world is he doing here? And so I pulled the door open and I said, Ammon, what can I do for you? You know, how are you doing? Tell you, that you look good. It's good to see you. What can I do here? We visited a bit. He kept talking about, he brought up several times, Sheriff, we spent 2 years in prison. One, those are federal charges. I don't have anything to do with that, especially the stuff down in Nevada. That's a totally different place. But I told him, I said, you've been on my mind quite a bit lately, and I'm at a place in my life where I want to find a way to forgive and move forward. And I would like to sit down with you at some point and have discussion on that. Have dinner, maybe get to know you outside of the fiasco that we dealt with. And we had some conversation back and forth there. And I believe that if we keep that spark of contention there, if we can't sit down with people and try to find some common ground to fix the problems that we face, that we're just going to continue to face those problems. In this day and age, with a divisive, federal government there in D.C., just turn on the news. It's depressing, and our media outlets feeding into that, and then the just buckets full of misinformation you can run into on the internet. It's going to take people sitting down and having the hard conversations, and not just leaving your differences at the door, but bringing them and setting them on the table and trying to understand why we have those differences, so that we can work through these issues and hand our kids a better country than we got.
I'm hoping that you could say a few words about our reckoning with history as the foundation of that, and the importance of looking at the full picture of American history as we attempt this conversation and moving on.
Did you ask what happened?
What happened?
Oh, I'm sorry, Lynn, we're not gonna do that right now, sorry.
I'm breaking the rules.
Yeah, sorry.
You know what,
We have very little time, so we're moving along here, but if,
we shook hands and parted on better terms
I'm sorry.
than we had the previous times. But we haven't sat down and hashed things out at this point.
Okay, so if you could reflect on the historical framework of understanding.
So I'll jump in, and this is my opinion, okay? Everybody is welcome to have their own. Don't black my eye afterwards. My opinion is that, you know, when faced in these conversations with these folks that we were dealing with out there, many times when they talked about how our government system is working, they would say, that's not what the forefathers meant. That's not what the forefathers wanted. Now, a couple things come to mind for me. And I've been around a while, but, you know, I asked Dad, because I thought maybe he was there. But I haven't found anybody that was sitting in the room with this nation's forefathers when they drafted the Bill of Rights. And so I know that, especially these guys that are younger than I am, they weren't there either. And the other thing is maybe they had, you know, specific ideas for where we would be 200 years down the road. Or maybe they were just simply trying to get through those times in fighting for and winning our independence from the crown and lay the foundation for what could become a great nation. And but this great nation, and I believe that we live in the greatest country on the face of the earth. That said, is from that time forward, we have also gone through many, many trials. At that time, slavery existed in this nation. Westward expansion, I love living in the West. But that westward expansion was built on basically the eradication of the indigenous peoples. So it hasn't always been this true and fair concept. And back at that time, you had to be a white man over the age of 21 and a landowner if you wanted to vote. I think that where our nation is today, in the amendments that have been made to our Constitution, has made this country a lot better place to live for our generation and for our kids. I think that it is more fair than it ever has been, but it's not without its problems. We have problems in our government at every level, to include the county government in Harney County. The sheriff could do a better job most days. The fact is, it takes everybody sitting down at the table like grown-ups and working through the problems that we face to hand that better nation off to the next generation.
So at this point, we are making a shift in our mode because we wanted to speak very seriously about the occupation, and we didn't want that to get in any way light and dismissive, because it can't be that. And I told you that it's part of the Humor Initiative. So we are now putting on our turn signals, and we are shifting over to the Humor Initiative component. We have had some moments where we have had to recognize that even in the most tragic situations that there can be those common qualities, but now we're going over entirely to the other side. So I would like to have you you already told me, but then I got a little bit confused on it. So could you tell about the hawk that turned into an eagle?
So you know, I've always had a soft spot for animals. You know, I was telling them earlier today about how, you know, my dream is just to be a goat farmer, like to go outside and feed them snacks. And
tell about how beautiful they are.
I like to tell them they look pretty. You know, goats like to hear that they look pretty. You know, and a lot of times I think that they're shunned in the animal world. So I used to work I started in law enforcement in the Lake County Jail over there in Oregon. And at that time, I lived in Summer Lake, and the jail was in Lakeview, and it was 79 miles to work. And I drove that every day. And it was actually good, because if you had a bad day, you really could get all of your griping and cussing out of the way before you got home, because you had an hour and 20 minutes to do it. But, along the way, I always saw wildlife. You knew where all the big bucks were, and you'd see all kinds of things hit on the road and that. One day I was driving along on my way home from work, and I'm out in a remote stretch of Highway 31 there, coming along, and I look down, and there's a bunch of ravens out in the other lane there, and I thought, I wonder what these things are chewing on. And I looked at them, and as I was going by, and I look, and there's this little hawk laying there, and he's got his head up, and these ravens are going to work on him. There's feathers flying, and this poor little guy. Yeah, it was a sad story. I was horrified for this little hawk. So I stopped. I felt, you know what, I'm gonna rescue this guy. So I jumped out and chased those ravens off, because really bullies run in packs. And so I hop out, and this little hawk's laying there on the ground. He's got his head up, and I thought, I'm going to drop this guy off to Fish and Wildlife on my way by. So I grab my jacket out, and I throw it over him, and I wrap him up, put him in my pickup on the floorboard. And yeah, he's wrapped up. He's just a nice little cocoon there on the floor. And I'm riding along, and I'm heading down the road, and there's an ODF and NW office there in Summer Lake, about 45 miles from where I was at that time, and feeling pretty good about myself, saving one of God's little creatures and all, doing God's work, whatnot, and cruising along there, and I was worried about him. I looked down on the floorboard, and he was down there, and drove a little further and looked down, saw my jacket move a little bit. I thought, oh, good, he's still alive, I'm feeling good about myself. And I was going through the little town of Paisley, and it's got a couple of 90-degree turns in it. And I had made one turn, and I saw the jacket roll a little bit, and little tail popped out. And I thought, well, he's getting out of that jacket. He'll probably just sit on the floor there, and he'll be okay. And I make the next turn, and I'm crossing the bridge going over the Shuwakan River, and all of a sudden my jacket comes to life. And this hawk, he comes backing out of that jacket, and I thought, okay, well, he'll just stay down there on the floor. This little rascal, he comes out of there, and he is mad. And he starts looking around. He looks around, and he looks up at me. And at that point, I knew I was in a little bit of trouble. So all of a sudden, this little hawk, he jumps up on the seat, and he stands up real tall, and all of a sudden, I swear, he's looking down at me. And I remember I picked up a little hawk about that big. This thing morphs into a full-size eagle next to me, and it's looking me in the eye. And of course, its beak is huge. It's like a prehistoric beast. Now, I've got kids, so I've seen enough of those Jurassic Park movies to know what was about to happen to me. And so as I'm crossing over this bridge, the only thing I can think to do is I jam up the brakes, and my pickup dies right there, and I open the door, and I jump out in the road, and I think, well, he'll fly away. And Little Hawk doesn't fly away. He won't get out of my pickup now, and he's mad, and he just came danger close to pecking my eyes out. So I think, okay, I'll go around to the other side, and I'll tap on the window, and that'll scare him out the door. And of course, people are driving past, looking at me like they're going to go call Sheriff McDonald and tell him one of his deputies high on drugs now. He's out there dancing around in the middle of the highway. And so I go over and I beat on the window, trying to scare him out the other side. Well, he's mad. He attacks the window, and he jumps up there, and I'm like, great, now I've got him farther into my pickup than I had him before. And at some point, it almost turned into a lethal force incident. But, I left my gun in the side of my door, and so it probably saved me. He probably would have took it away from me and hurt me with it. So anyway, this little hawk, he's in there for a bit, and he hops down and kind of walks across the street, across the seat there, and I think, well, good, he's heading for the door. He's going to get out. No, he stops and faces the steering wheel like he's figuring out how to boost my vehicle. And he pauses there for a little bit, and I don't even know how they do this. He turns, and then he hops out, and he puts his wings out, and he flies away in slow motion. Flies over to a haystack, and I'm no dummy. I see my opportunity. I ran around, I jumped in, and heck, I locked the door. I was afraid he was going to come back. But let me tell you this, I learned a valuable lesson that day. And I thought, next time I see one of God's little creatures in need, it's on its own.
I bet everyone would enjoy hearing a story about a urinalysis now.
Well, you know, a lot of my stories come from my job, and years ago when I was a parole and probation officer, you know, and we deal with a lot of people that are, you know, substance addicted, and one day we had this guy, and he was supposed to come in and give a urinalysis, and so he could be drug tested, and he didn't show up at the office, but we were in the basement portion of the building that we shared with our mental health care providers there locally. And so I get this strange phone call, and they said, hey, this guy came in, you guys were out of the office, and he started demanding that we give him a UA. And I said, okay, and what was his name? And he didn't tell me his name. I said, yeah, he was supposed to come in and give one. They said, well, he came in and he gave a urine sample. They said, but it was cold. Well, I mean, I've met people with ice water running through their veins, but he wasn't one of them. So I know that you know, we don't want to base a case just off of hearsay, and so I'm going to start doing a little looking into it, because one, it's a crime for them to fake their urinalysis, and so I do a little digging around, and I find out that this guy's been going down to our local sporting goods store and buying coyote urine. And so I'm like, okay, well, this guy, you know, he had a game plan. He probably should have popped it in the microwave first or something. You know, kids do not put coyote urine in your mom's microwave. That can be a disaster. So I go out driving around looking for this guy, and I see him walking down the street, and ironically he has a grocery bag full of somebody else's pills. Well, you get him pulled over, and I pull over with him, and I get out and start talking to him. I said, hey, I need to talk to you about the urine sample you gave to me. He goes, yeah, I passed my UA. It was clean for drug. It was clean. I said, well, yeah, it was clean for drugs. And I said, we need to talk a little bit more, because I'm pretty concerned here. And he goes, well, I gave a UA and it was clean. I said, yeah, again, it was clean for drugs, but you know, I got to take you in for observations. I think you might have rabies. And so he has this confused look on his face, and he's trying to figure out where I'm going with this. And I said, I'm going to tell you what, we sent that. One, it takes forever to get stuff back from the lab, and I feel bad for picking on the guy because he was a little slow apparently, because I told him I sent that off to the lab and it came back, and you showed a high level of rabbit enzymes with a hint of squirrel. And so this guy's sitting here and he's looking at me, and I said, well, you tell me, when's the last time you ate rabbit? He goes, well, I eat it sometimes. And this deputy that was with me goes, that's not what he asked you. When's the last time you ate it? And he goes, well, I ate some about a month ago. And I said, oh, BS. Rabbit doesn't stay in your system that long. I said, when's the last time you had it? I got to take you into custody right now. I have to quarantine you before we have an epidemic. You're going to go in for rabies treatments. And I turned to the deputy. I said, what is that, a 21-shot series? Oh, yeah, they give them in the belly. I said, yeah, hey, we're going to the hospital, buddy. I know. He goes, I faked my UA. What? I faked my UA. It was coyote urine. Coyote urine? Why would you do that? And anyway, I was like, oh, well, thank God I don't have to take you in for rabies treatment, but you're under arrest for falsifying the urinalysis.
I think I just think we can't leave without horses and hippies.
So, you know, I believe that your life experiences, everything you do, everybody you meet and get to know throughout the course of your life helps to form who you are and as time goes on. And when I was growing up out there in Little Drain, Oregon, out on Smith River Road, there was a hippie commune about, and I checked with our insurance company. I can say hippie. They said that it's not a protected class. So,
In Boulder.
anyhow, there's this hippie commune out past our little farm that I grew up on, and those folks were different. They were all nice people, and I rode the bus with their kids and went out to school, and so as I was growing up, you know, I bought a Clydesdale when I was 12 years old. It doesn't sound like the two tie together, but it did. So I had saved my money for years when I was a kid, and I really wanted a big draft horse. I'd seen one at the fair and just had to have one. And so I saved my money. I find one in the classifieds, and Mom and Dad let me call the lady. I can still remember her phone number, by the way. Not because she was cute, but the horse was pretty darn good looking. So Dad took me out there, and it wasn't, I didn't go to look at a Clydesdale. I went to look at this big Belgian draft mare, and she said, "That's not the horse for you. I've got this Clydesdale out there." And she showed it to me, and, you know, went around and kicked the tires, and wasn't sure if she was quite what I wanted. Went against my better judgment. I bought her anyway and took her home. She was the greatest horse ever. But it wasn't long before Dad determined that having a, you know, 1,800-pound Clydesdale out there eating up his winter hay supply and not earning his living was cost effective. So he puts her to work. We started logging, you know, with that horse, and, you know, working singles, small trees and stuff like that. So it wasn't long before Dad ended up going and buying a draft horse of his own, and then we started working as a team. We could move a lot bigger logs. So from the time I was 12 years old, I was setting chokers behind a team of horses. And by the time I was 14, I had learned how to fall and buck timber, and was running chainsaw out there and that. And it was a great. In fact, I had a lot of fun. Until I learned about all these child labor laws and everything, I had no idea that I was being used. I just thought I was having a good childhood. So anyhow, now this hippie commune up the road from us, those were the same folks that were typically at our logging protests and stuff. And they would be out protesting logging, but what we did was selective thinning. And it was geared at producing a healthier forest. You know, you go in, you got two trees growing close together, they're competing for nutrients, competing for light. We would take out the smaller or the less healthy of the two, and we'd skid it out with horses and, you know, wildflowers that grow up in the skid trails, and the horses fertilized on the way out, all kinds of, you know, fairy stuff, right? And so, anyway, this fella that owned the land that this commune was on signed a contract with my dad when I was 14 years old to go in there and thin a bunch of timber on that place. And so I spent an entire summer when I was 14 years old out there on this hippie commune. And I've seen some things. So we get out there, and I learned about gardening a long time before it was legal. I saw that. And, learned how to make wine that summer, and I was good. I bet I would have been good at that. And so we're out there, and we're logging with these horses. We go in, we'd fall timber in the evenings when Dad came home from his job at the mill. Then we'd go out on the weekend and bring the horses in, and we'd skid the logs out, and we'd deck them up. And every time we're out working the horses, around noon that day, my dad would say, "Hey, boy, take these horses down to the river and get them some water." And I'd take the horses down to the river, and I'd be standing down there with these two horses, letting them drink. And every time I went down there, these naked hippie ladies that were bathing in the river would come over and talk to me. And so here I am, I'm 14 years old, and I ride the bus, and here's this. My wife says that my stories are offensive, so I just want to get that out in the open. And here I am, I'm 14 years old, and I got these naked 30-plus-year-old ladies coming over and talking to me. I mean, we're talking old. And You know, I'm just standing there looking at the ground while these horses are drinking. How are you today, David? I'm fine. How are you, ma'am? You know, and, oh, are you having a good time up here? And I'm like, oh yeah, it's great. And I'd take the horses and I'd go away and I'd be walking past. I'd see my friends from the school bus out there, and I don't want to make eye contact with them because I just saw their mom naked, you know. And I'd be heading back up the hill to my dad, and you know, one day Dad says, "Hey boy, take these horses down to the river and get them some water." I said, "I don't want you, Dad." And he said, "What's wrong with you, boy?" I said, "Take those horses down there and get them some water." And I said, "Well, Dad, every time I take those horses down there to water them, these naked ladies come over and start talking to me, and you know, and I don't like it, you know." And yeah, I wasn't 16 when I was one of those. I was 14. Anyway, so I'm like, I don't like it. It bothers me. And he goes, "Oh, hey, don't tell your mother. You know how she gets, and I'll water them from now on." So now we're out there, we're skidding logs and everything. We can't get any work done because the old man's going down and watering the horses 4 times a day. The horses were so waterlogged they couldn't work anymore. And, but, you know, like I said, it was quite an experience, an eye-opener for a young kid.
Well, I'm aware of the time. Well, yes, everyone wants to talk after your story. I am aware of the time. I know we must move very soon to the giving of the award, and yet I just feel I have these people, he lives very remote. It's hard to get him here. So we have to ask the question, and I will cut myself off, and we'll get to the award after that. But have you ever been tasered?
Yes, I have. I've been tasered 3 times. Twice in training, and once while I was trying to take a guy into custody. And all 3 times it was by the same guy. And so, you know, and I used to work for him. He was my supervisor, but now he works for me. And, so, you know, the first time it happened, we were in training, and you know, I'm typically not the smartest guy in the room. So we're going through training, and they said, "Hey, okay, would anybody here be willing to get shot with the darts and take a drive stun on, you know, on the calf to be able to tell the difference?" Yeah, I'll do that. One, I had to. I was in the Army, and one of the other guys doing training that day had been in the Marine Corps, so I needed to beat him to the punch, right? And so, anyhow, the way that the taser works is it shoots these darts out of the cartridge, and they come out. One comes out at a 15-degree angle, and the other one shoots straight. And what closes the circuit between those 2 darts is human flesh, right? So electricity runs through them. So, and I had done my homework. I decided everybody else got shot with a taser. They hollered. Well, I had a game plan coming in because, you know, I was in the Army. I had to be tougher than the Marine guy, right? So I wasn't calm. So they get up there and they're like, "Are you ready?" And I gave them a thumbs up. Well, I exhaled as much air out of my lungs as I possibly could, right? So when they shot me with this taser, I didn't make a peep. And everybody's like, "Wow, you know, he's going to take a hit, right?" Well, and then the guy, he doesn't drop the cartridge off. He just takes it and sticks it down on my leg and arcs it again. Well, the electricity was running from the top of my shoulder all the way to my calf. And at that point, I felt my body like curl like a little rocking horse, you know, and I was in there, and that was my first experience with it. And of course, I wasn't prepared for that, so then I was squealing like a pig, and there was all kinds of bad things were happening. I was begging, you know, pleading God to make it stop, and all the normal things you do when you're getting hit with a taser. And so, anyway, the whole tough thing went out the window. But you fast forward that about a year, and there we had this feller that got his dogs impounded. They were running loose, and some nice person from out of the area stopped and picked him up. If you see somebody's ranch dogs running down the side of the road, you just leave them be, because somebody's going to find him, but this is about 30 miles out of town. Somebody from out of the area picked him up, and they dropped him off at the vet clinic, and then they got impounded because they didn't have rabies shots and all this. And the state of Oregon requires that they have the rabies shots. So guy figures out his dogs are down there at the impound. Well, he refuses to pay for them to have rabies shots. And he goes in there and essentially pushes his way past the staff and boosts his dogs out of lockup and heads for home. No, not the worst thing that can really happen. You know, that's one of those things that we can work through, right? And so I was with, then he was my sergeant, and the same guy that had shot me up during taser training and giggled while he was doing it. And we were riding together. We'd gone to lunch, and hey, let's go handle this call together. And so we headed out, and we found the rig, or we stopped at the vet clinic, got the description, figured out what happened. So my thought process was, let's go find this guy, get him to go back to town and pay for the rabies shots, no harm, no foul. We get out there, and he's a little bit bigger and stronger than I am. He's in a little better shape and a little bit wound up. And so he starts hollering at me, "These are my dogs." I'm like, "I understand that, sir, but the state of Oregon requires you go." We go through this goofy loop a couple times, and then the sergeant walks over there and he goes, "No, and until they have their rabies shots, those dogs are the property of the state of Oregon, and you're under arrest for burglary in the second degree and theft of services." He goes, "Handcuff him, Dave." So, now I'm actually going through my evaluation period and becoming a deputy and all, and so the boss just told me I'd take this guy into custody. So I'm like, "Turn around, put your hands behind your back. You heard the sergeant, you're under arrest." He turns around and walks off. So I get one handcuff on this guy, and all of a sudden he just goes, "No!" And it was like a rodeo bull coming out of the chute. He starts spinning in circles, and I'm hanging on and losing ground. You know, I was a pretty decent wrestler back in the day, and knew my way around the map pretty well. So at some point, I was losing control of the situation. So I scooped him up and did one of my best attempts at winning a high school wrestling match, and I put him down hard, and that didn't even slow the guy down. So now we're down on the ground, and he's trying to get up, and I chop him down and get up, and he's still got a handcuff on, which can be used as weapons, right? So I'm trying to get custody of this guy, and I look back over at the rig, and there's my sergeant over there, and it's like, I don't know if you've ever seen Toy Story, where the Mr. Potato Head sees Woody get knocked out the window. So he makes this goofy look, and then he runs over in slow motion, and it seems to happen to me frequently, the slow motion thing. He runs over in slow motion. He comes over, and I'm wrestling with this guy, got him on the ground. I said, "Help me get his other arm so I can get him into cuffs." And he goes, "Move your hand," and reaches down and he whips my taser off my belt. Now, I've got PTSD from this guy swinging a taser around the last time. And I'm wrestling around down there with this guy, and he goes, "Stop fighting or I'm going to tase you." Well, next thing I know, he's got this taser on the back of my arm, and he's arcing that thing, and so now I'm in a fight with this guy, and I've got my boss tasing me. And he gets done, and he says, "Stop tasing her, I'm going to tase you again." And I said, "Please stop fighting, I can't take another tasing." Anyway, we get the guy into custody. And we have him sitting over there, and he's sitting there, and pretty soon he goes, "I didn't mean for you to get tased." It's all right. Worse things have happened to me. Then we get him, somebody comes down because the sergeant was a K-9 officer at the time, so he didn't have room to transport the guy. It took 35 minutes to get back up there, so thank God I was out there with somebody. Well, actually, we probably could have resolved it if the sergeant hadn't gone RoboCop on him out there. But so when I get back in the rig with the sergeant, I say, if you have a problem with my job performance, you could just give me a bad eval. You don't have to tase me.
Okay, so now, may I just say I rest my case on the Mark Twain thing? So now, please stay for another 4 or 5 minutes, and are we going to pull back the curtain? Okay, well, there's nothing behind the curtain, don't get your hopes up here. What we're going to do is, as soon as the curtain is out of the way, we are going to ask everyone with us tonight who is affiliated with the Senate of the American West. So that could be board members, emeritus board members, spouses of those board members, students, faculty affiliates, supporters, everyone affiliated with the Senate of the American West. I might have left somebody out. Oh, Gloria has heard every story about the Senate of the American West that I've ever had, or affiliated. So anyway, Houston, you should come up too. So we will now have, okay, that's, how much space? Something, I see we still have a curtain. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about who's going to come up on the stage here. Okay, so very soon what we're going to do is we'll have all those people come up on the stage and stand behind us, and then you and I will stand in front here, and I will read the citation. The citation is, when you see it, or hear it, or whatever, next, it will be Allison does a wonderful job of putting this into calligraphy, so it will be a really, really beautiful thing. So, okay, but it's just a ratty little printout right now. So now we're ready to have Senate of the American West staff, certainly everybody just come up here and stand behind us, and we'll thank you. Could you pass it from my backpack? I'm sorry, you're aware, so I get my glasses called. What's this? I'm getting my glasses. Yeah. Oh, your glasses. Yes. I'm going to stuff with this.
I love these folks. They're all so nice.
Okay. It looks like we are assembled. Many old friends greeting each other. It's very nice to see that. Okay, so now I shall read the citation that when you see it will be ready for him. Okay. The image of the sheriff is omnipresent in the familiar legends and myths of the 19th century American West. But your response to the armed takeover of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge brought to the nation's attention a deeper and much more restorative meaning for sheriffs in the 21st century. When you shouldered the role of the keeper of the peace and the negotiator in determined pursuit of resolution, integrity, courage, honesty, dignity, and empathy, a set of virtues that often go aerial and float off into abstraction, touched down on the territory of Harney County. While humility immunizes you against arrogance, your experience in war guides and maintains your commitment to peace. You are well aware that the better angels of our nature are not our steadfast companions, often disappearing just when we most need them. But you also know that their frequent departures enhance the relief and the joy of their equally frequent reappearances. To use the words you spoke on February 11, 2016, right now we have the opportunity as people in this great nation to come together to work through our differences and start getting things back together. The example of sustainable heroism that you have given us reveals the hope embedded in the words of a poet not famed for his cheer, when it seems that, quote, the center cannot hold, unquote, that That is actually the perfect time to put heart and soul into holding it together anyway. Ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. When I first learned about this, I didn't feel like I was a person who measured up on the same level as other people who have received this award. And to be honest with you, it's very humbling, and I'm thankful that people feel that way about me. I don't see things that way. We had a job to do. We did the job that needed to be done, and we did. For a minute, I thought there were going to be beams. We just did the job that we thought needed to be done, and there were a lot of us that worked together trying to put things right. And I'm very grateful to everybody that invited me out here, and I'm thankful for this award, and I'm thankful to be, held in as high regard as some of the other folks that have received this award. And I'm very thankful for your friendship, and I treasure your kindness, and I just thank you very much.
Well, if I were any happier, I need medication. So thank you so much for joining us. Don't be a stranger. The film that I was a part of that got me to go to Harney County, there will be a screening of that in Harney County that I get to be the MC for. So anyone who would like to join me on that outing, we could have a Setting the American West unit attending that, and then we will have a screening of that film. David's a principal figure in that film, so maybe we would beg and plead that when we do a screening of that film here, you would come back. So that's it.